Many people today consider themselves allies of the LGBTQIA community, and that's great. Society has come a long way in recognizing the dignity and rights of queer people, and many individuals generally want to be supportive. However, many of us, including myself, still carry assumptions about attraction, gender identity, and relationships that unintentionally exclude members of the queer community. This is not because we are malicious people, but because all human beings have blind spots, especially regarding experiences that are not our own. My goal in this episode is to explore some of these blind spots so that we can become better allies and build a more genuinely inclusive society. I'm Nicole, Ecleo, an overthinker with outcast opinions, and this is Niconoclast, where popular ones don't get a free pass. For today's outcast opinion, I want to propose a challenging idea. We say that we accept the LGBTQIA community and yet fail to account for them in how we structure our society. There's much talk about inclusivity, and yet this community gets excluded from norms that shape how we perceive social interactions. If we want to become true allies, then we must examine and rewrite our own biases that stem from years and years of social conditioning. Because at the end of the day, we cannot claim to accept a community and yet live in a way that fundamentally erases them. You cannot say that you're inclusive to queer people just because you allow them to join various groups in society, such as letting them obtain an education, go to work, or even live. That's like saying that your building is inclusive to people in wheelchairs just because you allow them to enter the building, even though your building does not have any ramps or elevators. Do you understand? It's not enough to include people, but rather we have to structure our systems in such a way that they're functionally inclusive. That minority groups such as the queer community are considered in the design of these systems so that their identities, their experiences, their feelings, their needs, and their rights are acknowledged. In my view, inclusivity should not be performative, but structural. Thus, I'd very much like it if we stopped giving each other praise for the bare minimum of letting queer people, who are human beings just like anyone else, by the way, enter into spaces and slapping inclusivity on it when we still very often disregard their unique lived realities, even unintentionally, and when we still have a very long way to go to ensure that they have access to the same opportunities as we do, both legally and socially. The socially part is what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to start my argument with what I've been personally dubbing the Four Horsemen of Erasure. My first point is that some traditional social norms built on stereotypes from heteronormativity, amatonormativity, allonormativity, and cisnormativity are exclusionary to the LGBTQIA community. Let's start with heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is the assumption that being straight is the default, normal, or correct sexuality. With that, it assumes one man, one woman structures in relationships. I'm going to illustrate examples of how heteronormativity shows up in everyday life and demonstrate how social norms based on heteronormativity exclude homosexuals and bisexuals, even unintentionally. One very common example is asking girls, do you have a boyfriend? Or boys, do you have a girlfriend? Which excludes the possibility that they could be gay or bi, or that their partner is non-binary, and whatever in between. This is usually meant to be a harmless question, truly, but we have to be mindful about how it's phrased, because it carries the assumption that the partner of the female person that you're asking would be male, or that the partner of the male person that you're asking would be female. What if their partner is of the same gender as them? We generally acknowledge the existence of queer people, but sometimes we forget when asking questions such as these. Why might that be? Why are we assuming that everyone would have a partner of the opposite gender? That's heteronormativity in action. So, here's my proposal. How about instead, ask gender-neutral dating questions such as, are you single? Are you seeing anyone? Do you have a partner? Are you interested in dating? Etc. Or better yet, just don't ask unless you're asking specifically because you're interested in them. More on that later. Here's another example of heteronormativity, and let me use an anecdote. In my social science course last semester, our teacher asked the boys in my class how they would feel if a girl made the first move on them. Sometime after that, I initiated a chit chat about it with some classmates. They began to talk about how the guy should make the first move, the guy should pay for the date, the guy should open the door, etc. But then I thought, and I asked, what if there are two guys? What if there are none? Who, then, by this system that you're proposing, would make the first move, pay for the date, open the door? No answer. They glitched. And that, my dear viewer, is what I mean when I say that we've accepted the existence of queers and yet fail to account for them in a lot of social interactions. The social norms that are widely accepted to apply to romance are not even applicable to a lot of homosexuals. I don't mean to judge, but I really want to ask, if these social norms, the ones that assign roles about initiation, dominion, and generosity according to birth sex, are universal and correct, then why are they inapplicable to same-sex relationships? Why are we claiming to accept homosexuals and yet also accept a system, a so-called correct code of instructions for romance, that excludes homosexuals? These are called gender roles, and the gender roles that we have in place currently are heteronormative because they assume distinct roles for each partner according to their gender, and they assume that both genders are present in every relationship. The woman stays at home and the man goes to work, the woman rears children, the man provides material, the woman is nurturing and the man is protective. Does that sound familiar? It's patriarchy. I'd say that the patriarchy and homophobia are closely related, but that's a discussion for another time. Still, I hope that you can see what I'm pointing at here. The patriarchy not only affects women, but affects the queer community as well. Heteronormativity has caused us to believe that your birth sex dictates what your role is in the relationship. But what about relationships between two men? Between two women? Between non-binary people? Between intersex people? Are gender roles truly universal if there exist healthy relationships that function without them? A challenge for traditional gender role systems is explaining how they apply to same-sex and non-binary relationships. So here's my proposal. How about we start believing in the following? A man doing nice things for his woman should be labeled normal relationship thing instead of manly thing or duty because he's a man. Women should also do nice things for their man, not necessarily in the same way, but as long as they're both happy and as long as they're not assuming that the heteronormative structure is true for everyone else. That leads me to another example. Asking same-sex couples, so who's the woman in the relationship when they're both men? Or so who's the man in the relationship when they're both women? Is heteronormative. It's once again projecting heteronormativity because it's reinforcing the idea that all couples must have one man, one woman structures, perhaps not by identity, but still by role. It's invalidating because it implies that same-sex relationships are insufficient without distinct gender roles, even if it's not intended in that way. And it's also invalidating the identities of the people in the relationship because here's the thing, why are you asking who's the man when there is no man? It's again all tied to the patriarchy because it assumes that gender roles are necessary for a relationship's functionality. That brings me to another example. Many assume that homosexual relationships still have one woman, one man coded gender roles because of the common theme of lesbian relationships having one masc, one femme. And while this is indeed a common relationship structure, it's important to remember that it is only one of the many valid ways that homosexual relationships can present. Lesbian couples can have both girls be masculine presenting or both girls be feminine presenting. The thing is, gender expression and sexual orientation are two different things. So you don't have to be like a man to like a woman, and vice versa. Likewise, speaking of men, not all gay men are feminine. A lot of gay men can appear very masculine and can be cisgender, as gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation are different things. The lines can get very blurry due to media portrayal, as gay men are often seen using feminine products, having many female friends, using a high-pitched voice, etc. But again, this is just one of the many valid ways for someone to be gay. So how about this? Let's remind ourselves of the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And let's simply put, stop assuming stuff about people until they tell us. Let's keep fighting the part of our brain that loves to assume things. Advocate for more diverse representation in the media. And remember that humans are extremely complex, many of them unable to fit into the boxes that society has so long considered default. Now, let's move on to another example of heteronormativity. Aside from the assumption that every relationship operates on a one man, one woman basis, the vice versa is also a common assumption. That every time a man and a woman are seen together, that means that they're dating. Let me first give credit where credit is due. This generation has grown to accept male-female friendships, but there is still a long way to go because a lot of the time, the acceptance of male-female friendships is very narrow, as it only accepts friendships as in casually talking for professional purposes, but is still heteronormative about actual friendship, as in people who spend time together outside of school or work, who know things about each other, and who care about each other's well-being. Immediately, for many people, when they see this, they think, oh, they're in love. And while that may very well be true, it's also harmful and heteronormative to assume it's true all of the time. The thing is, we don't know their status until they tell us. What if one of them is gay? What if one of them is ace? Or what if they just don't like each other like that? To assume that any and all personal emotional connections between people of the opposite sex are romantic and or sexual is heteronormative, because to reach that assumption already means to assume that both individuals are straight, that relationships are between one man and one woman, and that close interactions between men and women are inherently romantic. Of course, sometimes we are correct in assuming, because human as we are, we have the ability to analyze social dynamics. However, when we are wrong, it could be invalidating to those in the LGBTQIA plus community, and even to those who are not. Otherwise, it could just be invasive because, and this is a question I've had for a long time, why must one take up so much of one's headspace trying to determine if two strangers are romantically affiliated? Turns out, there's a word for it. Let me introduce you to the second of the Four Horsemen of Erasure that I want to discuss in this episode, the term Amatonormativity, which is the assumption that everyone wants romance. People love talking about romance, such as speculating if two people are together, as mentioned earlier. However, when it gets to a point where discussion turns into assumptions, which I argue that it often does, it's invalidating to those who don't participate in or align with traditional standards of romance, such as aromantic people. I notice that nearly every time I meet or befriend someone new, the first question is either A, do you have a crush? Or B, who's your crush? Let's unpack these questions one by one, starting with question B. Question B is very clearly a metanormative because by asking who, the asker is already assuming that the recipient has one. What about aromantic people? What about people who simply don't have one? Being asked this question frequently growing up can make aromantic people feel invalidated because it already carries the underlying assumption that feeling romance is the norm, the standard, or even the necessity, which can make them feel left out, pressured to conform, or as though something is wrong with them. I have heard multiple stories from both real life friends and online strangers wherein they came up with a fake crush upon answering that question, tried to convince themselves that they liked a certain person because everyone else did, and or even agreed to stage a fake relationship, all in hopes of attempting to belong in and to appear normal in this amatonormative world, which all goes to show how much amatonormativity actually affects aromantic people. As for question A, it may appear harmless because it's not carrying that automatic amatonormative assumption. But a lot of the time, based on my experience and on that of those I know, when the recipient says no, the asker's follow up question is almost always, are you sure? Or they accuse them of lying. And that is when it becomes clearly amatonormative. Why is it difficult for a lot of people to conceptualize the notion of someone not taking an interest in romance? What if they are interested in romance but just don't know who yet? What if they're working on themselves? What if they're confused about their feelings? What if they're aromantic? There exists a multitude of reasons why someone would not have a crush in a particular moment, and to assume that their claims are automatically lies is invalidating to their experiences, regardless of, but especially if, they're aromantic. In addition, amatonormativity is also present in typical, seemingly harmless life stage questions. People ask couples, when are you going to get married? And once they get married, the next question that is asked is, when are you going to have children? This is still amatonormativity, because amatonormativity is not just assuming that everyone wants romance, but also that everyone wants romance in a certain specific way. However, the truth differs because everyone can have their own timeline. Sayings such as get married before 30 seem to forget that some don't want to get married before 30, that some don't want to get married, and that some don't even want a romantic relationship at all. Even when we don't fully understand people's choices, I believe that as allies, we should advocate for people's right to make choices. At the end of the day, people are complex and have their own lives, and I believe that we should work toward building safe spaces that make people feel comfortable to be their authentic selves and to make authentic decisions. Speaking of decisions, it's important to remember that romantic desire, romantic attraction, and consenting to enter a romantic relationship are distinct, and not all may be present at once. Let me attempt to illustrate this with an analogy. Let's say that you already have a plan for what you're going to do today, having time block the activities that you want to do on your calendar, none of which involve going to a mall. However, your friend calls you and asks you if you'd like to go to the mall. Even though you didn't originally plan to go to the mall, you accept the offer excitedly, not begrudgingly, even though the idea only occurred to you after they asked. This was my attempt at describing recipromantics, a micro-label under the aromantic spectrum for people who only feel romantic attraction when someone expresses romantic attraction first, hence the word part recipro from the word reciprocate. In a way, they won't really think of a person in that way unless the person thinks of them like that first. Just like in my scenario earlier, wherein you weren't thinking of going to the mall in the first place, and yet suddenly wanted to go when offered. Now, the flip side is also a real identity. Lithoromantics are people who stop feeling attraction once it's reciprocated. Do you know that thing where you get this urge to do the dishes, but then your mom tells you to and you don't want to anymore? Upon realizing that both you and your mom want you to wash the dishes, you lose interest in washing them. Lithoromantics might be something like that, but only they can tell you. Others are cupioromantic, wanting a romantic relationship but not feeling romantic attraction. On the other hand, orchid romantics feel romantic attraction but don't desire a romantic relationship. These are just a few among many labels in the aromantic spectrum. Now, why is this important? Amatonormativity assumes that everyone feels romance in the same way, and that the reciprocation of such would definitely lead to a romantic relationship. But people's experiences differ. I also wanted to debunk the common assumption that aromantic people hate romance, as that's not what being aromantic actually means. Some hate romance, but a lot of them actually like romance or are indifferent to it. The aromantic spectrum is an umbrella term for people whose romantic attraction has less frequency and or less intensity than that of others. It doesn't mean that they're hateful people who think romance should be abolished. They simply don't often feel that way. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed something. This distinction between attraction and relationships doesn't only exist in romance. Everything that I'm saying here is also applicable to sexual attraction. But Nicole, aren't those the same thing? No, they're not. Society already seems to be excellent at acknowledging relationships that are sexual but not romantic, which is why We have disseminated terms such as friends with benefits, hookup culture, one night stand, summer flings, and more. In each of these terms, the core message is delivered. One can desire sexual activity with others without desiring an emotional attachment to them. This then begs the question, why does society understand sex without romance, but not romance without sex? This seems to me to be deeply ingrained allonormativity, the assumption that everyone wants sex. When combined with amatonormativity, it means that the common assumption is that everyone wants romance, that everyone wants sex, and that the two always go hand in hand. But for some people, they don't. Let me introduce you to the split attraction model, a psychological framework that distinguishes between different forms of attraction and allows them to be viewed as separate orientations. Simply put, romantic attraction and sexual attraction do not always coexist. Some people may be aromantic but not asexual, and others may be asexual but not aromantic. Some even experience attraction differently depending on gender. For instance, some may be romantically attracted to only women and yet be sexually attracted to only men. Nicole, that's so complicated. Yeah, welcome to being a human. Human beings are too complex to be thrown into particular boxes. Now, the reason why this is important to know is, again, tied to exclusion. When we make assumptions about people's experiences, it can make them feel as though theirs are invalid. When I was 9 years old, my classmates invited me to a game of Smash or Pass. That time, I didn't yet know what that was, so I asked, then they explained. Afterward, I reluctantly agreed to join, mostly because I didn't want to feel left out since everyone there was joining. During the game, they would show photos of male celebrities, and the others had to say either smash or pass, and I always picked pass. Then, they would laugh at me and say things like, "How could you pass on him? He's so hot." And I'd say, "I don't even know who that is. Why would I do that with him?" Some also mentioned names of our male classmates, and I said pass to all of them too. And they'd go, "How could you pass on him? He's so hot." Again. And I'd say, "Sure, but he bullies people, submits all his work late, and is rude to teachers." With that, they tried to tell me that that's not how the game works and that I'm only supposed to consider their appearance. And yet, before the game began, they defined Smash as someone whom I would sleep with. I wanted to point out this contradiction. I wanted to ask them, what if the way that attraction works for me is different from yours? But I wanted to keep the peace. So I stayed silent for years, but the memory still haunts me. In Hear Me Out games, I would name whomever I thought was socially acceptable. Whenever someone made a dirty joke, I would force a laugh. Because if I deviated in any way, there came social consequences. Whenever I deny being attracted to a conventionally attractive boy, people say that I'm faking hard to get so that you would chase me, or that I'm arrogant because I think I'm better than him. Whenever I talk to a boy, people stare, whisper, and assume that I'm trying to seduce him, even without any context. The world didn't feel like a safe place for people like me, and it still doesn't. I grew up thinking that I was broken, unwell, incomplete, blind, defective. I grew up in deep confusion as I tried to understand what people saw in pornography, thirst traps, sexual songs, etc., that I didn't. I grew up thinking that there must be something wrong with me. Until now, it feels alienating. But I wish that I could go back in time and tell little me that my lack of sexual attraction wasn't wrong, just different. Interestingly, that's one of the main ideas of my podcast, that different doesn't mean wrong. Unfortunately, it's very human for us to dismiss experiences that we don't understand. We hate subjects that we find difficult. We discard puzzles that we can't solve. We judge cultures that we don't practice. But what happens when we judge, discard, and hate people whom we don't understand? It turns into whipping the hands of left-handed children. It turns into burning women for saying scientific terms. It turns into forcing people into detention, starvation, and labor for believing in 5 theological pieces of literature. Are we sure that everything that we don't understand is nonsense, and that all nonsense deserves violence? Following that line of reasoning is dangerous, and the history supports that. Why is human thinking frequently in the manner of us versus them, in group versus out group, normal versus different? And speaking of different, going back to allonormativity, I do want to point out that allonormativity can affect different groups differently. Asexual girls may be infantilized, whereas asexual boys are straight up disbelieved, mocked, or seen as not real men. In my previous episode, I hypothesized that the reason why the glorification of the violation of consent is normalized in Taylor Swift's song is because of the underlying assumption that all men enjoy sexual or sexual adjacent activity. Connecting this here, I also observed that asexual men are treated differently, because for men, sex is a symbol of power, a display of dominion, and a badge of honor. They show off their conquests because it makes them look strong and attractive. Once again, all connected to the patriarchy. So what happens to the men that aren't into that stuff? They get called weak, using a word that I can't say here. To me, however, I don't think that a man's value is affected by their romantic life or sex life. To me, they're valuable simply in virtue of the fact that they are human. For too long, we have shamed men for things like not being able to get a girlfriend or simply not having one. But for me, there's no singular pathway to being a man. If you're a man, then you're a man, and that's all. However, cisnormativity seems to overlook that. Cisnormativity is the assumption that everyone's gender aligns with their sex assigned at birth, which excludes transgender, non-binary, and intersex identities. Now, we can argue all day about whether trans women are women and all that good stuff, and I'd happily discuss it in a future episode. But right now, I want to shed light on a topic that's much less discussed: intersex people. Ever since learning about intersex identities a few months ago, I realized a fundamental flaw in cisnormative thinking. In arguments such as, your gender is what's in your pants, or your gender is your chromosomes, or your gender is how you look, or your gender is what's assigned to you at birth, or your gender is your hormones. And it's that not all the time do those things align. Intersex people have a combination of male characteristics and female characteristics. You can argue all day that gender is binary, but at the end of the day, if gender is based on biological sex, and even biological sex is not binary, then how can gender be binary? How can cisnormativity be true if 1 to 2% of the world is biologically, physically non-compliant with it? That percentage may not seem like much until you realize that with the current global population at 8.3 billion, that's 166 million people, which is even larger than the entire Philippine population. Thus, picture this: 166 million people are forgotten when a form only gives the options male and female. 166 million people are forgotten when someone greets a crowd using ladies and gentlemen. And what's worse, a lot of them underwent intersex genital mutilation, or IGM, which is a surgery done on intersex infants and children to make their genitalia appear typically male or female, in order to fit into societal gender norms, often causing physical harm and psychological trauma. Do you see? It's not even about feelings anymore. Gender roles are so deeply ingrained that non-consensual and medically unnecessary surgeries are being performed just to fit into binary ideals. Still, reality differs. Honestly, if one needs evidence that gender is a spectrum, look no further than intersex people because they prove that even sex is a spectrum too. Still, I personally find it frustrating that a lot of people still don't know or act as if they don't know the difference between the two, sex and gender. Let's recount my earlier mention of forms, for instance. I was working on my pre-enlistment form recently for school, and I noticed something strange. The question asked gender, and the only options were female and male. I knew what they meant, but also, why? If they meant gender, as in gender, then where's non-binary? If they meant sex, then where's intersex? Whichever way the form went erased multiple queer identities, which made me uncomfortable. It was especially disappointing to see, knowing that it came from the school that taught me about the queer community multiple times. Under that same institution, I had to take quizzes on the different LGBTQIA plus identities. This neatly ties back to my point earlier when I said that we say that we acknowledge the existence of the LGBTQIA plus community and yet fail to account for them in how we structure our society. Do I think that the people who made that form are evil queerphobes who wrote that question intending to make queer people cry? No, they probably weren't. However, I want to show it as an example of how deeply rooted cisnormativity is in our society and as an encouragement to structure our words better moving forward. I think that a great example of structuring our words to be more inclusive is one of the last lines in the song Mean Girls by the girl group Cat's Eye. It says, "God bless the T-girls and all the in-between girls," which is commonly interpreted to refer to trans women and people in the non-binary spectrum. I think that it's great that they included them, and honestly, it shows that it's not even that hard. Bringing back the point that I made when discussing heteronormativity, how about we use gender-neutral language? I don't think it's that hard to say something like ladies, gentlemen, and all in between, or even just everyone. These changes may seem small, but to people with those identities, it could mean everything. It's important to note that language is a powerful tool and that it can shape belief. Speaking of language shaping belief, I want to share an important discovery that I made about pronouns a few months ago. Maybe you already know this and I'm just late to the party, but I still want to share it because it fascinates me. All these years, I've been calling people by their correct pronouns and very much make it a point, whether it's to their face or behind their back. However, I didn't understand why I had to call people by their correct pronouns when they weren't there, because I thought that it was about not hurting their feelings, and how could I hurt that person's feelings if they weren't there, right? Wrong. I was so wrong. Turns out, pronouns are not about feelings, they're about identity. The reason why we should call people by their pronouns is to rewire ourselves to think of them in that way, like what I said earlier about language shaping belief. For instance, I once had a trans man friend with pronouns he, him. As basic decency dictates, I called him he, him. Somehow, over time, after referring to him like that for a year, I somehow now really do see him as a boy, and mind you, I have known him for a decade, so I was there when he was still a cisgender girl for many years. Yet somehow, I really don't see him as a girl anymore. The thought of it is weird and makes me and him laugh. He's very feminine presenting, he's still biologically female, but my brain is physically incapable of seeing him as a female and keeps flagging him male. That, my dear listener, is the power of a language. I just kept using masculine terms for him until my brain updated its model of him from female to male. I realize now that that's exactly what transgender people want. They don't just want you to accept that they identify that way, but rather they want you to identify them that way too. That's why pronouns are important. They're a tool to help us rewire our brains to see this person differently. So now I've explained the Four Horsemen of Erasure, but you might be wondering, why does this matter for allyship? It's because allyship is not merely the absence of hostility, it's the willingness to notice when systems unintentionally exclude people and to make adjustments when needed. If I claim to support wheelchair users but refuse to install ramps, to me, my support is incomplete. Likewise, if I support queer people but never question assumptions that erase them, then my allyship is also incomplete. At least that's what I believe, and perhaps that's what you do too. It's really easy to say or to cognitively hold the value that everyone is equal and entitled to their own decisions about their personal life as long as it doesn't affect other people. In fact, that's what a lot of LGBTQIA plus advocacies are centered around: the goal of equal rights for all, regardless of their affiliation with the queer community. This is indeed an extremely important aspect of allyship to shine light on, as it concerns immediate health, security, and safety among all members of the LGBTQIA community. However, I would like to ask questions regarding this line of reasoning, not because it's incorrect, but because I deem it incomplete, for three reasons. As I said earlier, it's very easy to cognitively hold a belief. It's very easy to logically think, well, yeah, duh, who a person likes does not dictate their worth. They're still human. It doesn't mean that they'll do badly at their job or that they're evil or whatever. It's easy to think that. It's common sense and it's basic human decency, according to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. My first question is, are we sure that cognitively concluding that we're all equal is sufficient to be considered an ally? As I demonstrated earlier, and as one may observe from one's daily life, humans are capable of believing or claiming to believe certain things and yet act as though they don't. Whether it's hypocrisy, ultra-crepidarianism, or a non-malicious lack of self-awareness, call it what you want. But I don't think that we should be assigning the label ally, whether it's to ourselves or to others, merely on the basis of thinking that we're all equal. Because let's face it, humans are weird. I've met very passionate feminism advocates who sexually harass multiple girls. I've met people who are not racist, yet say the N-word like it's nothing. I've met voters who claim to care about children, yet campaign for pedophilic rapists and child murderers. Of course, these examples sound extreme, but they all contribute to my point. If these examples disturb you, then perhaps we should rethink our definition of allyship. There's a very popular saying, actions speak louder than words. And if you believe in this saying, then I urge you to think about why this seems to not really apply in queer allyship, about why saying we're all equal is enough to call it a day, even while participating in systems, trends, and conversations that directly contradict that statement. My second question is, are we sure that our standards for treating the LGBTQIA community are sufficient? The thing is, a lot of people consider themselves allies of the queer community merely because they don't actively, overtly cause harm to them. They think that just because they would not be the type to say boo at pride parades, or the type to kick their child out for being gay, or the type to fire their employee for being gay, it means that they're taking the effort to respect the queer community. That could very well be the case, but I want to challenge the notion of that being the clear, complete picture of what an ally is. Let me ask you, would you say that not throwing trash in the ocean is the same as cleaning it? Would you say that not cutting down trees is the same as planting them? Would you say that not stealing from the poor is the same as donating to them? If you're anything like me, you probably don't. And if that's the case, why do a lot of us equate not causing obvious, overt harm to the queer community to being an ally? The way I see it, tolerance is not acceptance, nonviolence is not peace, and respect is not support. We have to increase our skill at distinguishing passiveness from proactiveness. I see my generation talk a lot about the false equivalence fallacy in comment sections lately, and I want to bring it up here. The idea that maybe, just maybe, being an ally is more than just being not homophobic. You don't have to be homophobic to disregard queer people. Am I saying that all of us have to become queer activists? Well, at the very least, I'm saying that being an ally involves continually educating oneself about the queer community and training oneself to rewrite harmful biases that stem from years and years of social conditioning, as mentioned earlier. Like a good friend of mine once said, if the standard is not killing queer people, then the bar is in hell. My third question is, have we forgotten the phrase little things can make a big difference? Like I said before, this episode is meant to focus on the social aspect of queer community integration, which may leave a lot of you confused. You may be wondering why, in this episode specifically, I'm not really addressing gay marriage legalization or shootings at pride parades or Oscar Wilde's imprisonment. And these are all important topics that I'll get to eventually. However, there's something that I find missing about common queer community discourse. It forgets the connection of the social to the legal, of biases to prejudice, of the little things to the big things. You can advocate for changes to the law all you want, but let me ask you, who makes the laws? Humans, right? And what process is involved in discerning what laws should be in place? Thinking. It all starts in the brains of the lawmakers. With that, I find it so idealistic, for now at least, to be chasing after, for example, the legalization of gay marriage. When we live in a society where people are still saying that being gay is a choice or an abomination or a shortcut to hell, a society where the nuclear family is the only ideal goal, a society where people carry misconceptions, assert assumptions, and are afraid of change. People are the ones writing the laws. So if you want to change the law, change the people. Educate them, call them out on their prejudice, help them to understand that queers may be new and different, but they're not bad. How can people understand if they don't learn? How can they learn if they're not taught? How can we progress into a world where queers are treated as everyone else if the people in that world are still refusing to let go of their conservative ways? Change is scary. I get it. It's scary navigating an ever changing world where anyone can be anything. When I say that I'm not perfect, I mean it. As I'm sitting here telling you to rewrite your own biases, I also struggle with my own. Do I understand all queers? Of course not. I'm still confused about xenogenders and wondering what that would imply for the definition of gender itself. I'm still confused about neopronouns and wondering why existing pronouns fail to suffice to describe some people's experiences. I'm still confused about polygamy and polyamory and wondering about its implications on consent, fidelity, and parenthood. Confusion is part of being human, but that's also why bigotry can happen. Because some uncommon terminology messes with people's brains and they resort to disregarding it entirely. It's a coping mechanism. And that's why I started Niconoclast. As I mentioned in my channel trailer, I want to encourage others to ask questions. How about, instead of letting our confusion about queer people justify dismissing them entirely, we instead learn to sit in that confusion? How about we learn how to be comfortable with not having all the answers? None of us do, and that's okay. The way I see it, embracing the confusion is what can make us better allies.